Well, hello again.
Hello, hello. The plan for back-to-back meetings was so much smarter in theory.
Yeah.
Hey,
Hello, hello. I will warn you all now, I'm about 50% focus mentality right now. I'm presenting on You Choose in like 2 hours. So my brain is on like how to present in 5 minutes. But
So the usual
see
Abby.
where we get to. The the usual Abby. That you think I can do lots of things that I don't think I can do. Yeah, I gotta have you as like a cheerleader in my corner all the time now.
What
I
is
need
you
to.
choose?
It's the Whitney, Lee, and Victor Farsick like webinar podcast thing on YouTube
Okay.
that is where they go through the entire CNCF landscape. Uh like one kind of category of thing at a time while they like build on top of the things they built. So like they started with like how to package up software and then how to test it and then how to
Mm,
deploy it and then how to secure it and then and so on, and they're building platforms this season. So we're doing so Crossplane and Kubevela are the two CNCF projects, and then Cradix as another Apache 2 is on tonight for platform APIs. And then in a couple weeks, it will be Portals. Backstage is the only CNCF project, but then it's also Roadie and Port. And then they're
Okay.
doing something else. A one-shot tools. I'm not sure what the projects are for that. And then miscellaneous platform tools. So four episode series. It's quite
One
fun.
shot tools like AI related or
No, it's gonna be like I think it's gonna end up being like a Tecton and like kind of like the workflow tools. So like Argo workflows, Tecton would be my guess, but I actually don't know what the
okay.
tools are for it. Um, so yes, we'll see. Hi everyone. On to on to assessment things. The final kind of group information discovery section. So this will be good. We
oh,
want to talk about the most important stuff we can today, right? So came in with some questions around the interface section in particular. We didn't really get through the questions on that one because we were seeing some challenges with the way that the model was written in comparison to what we think about things, in comparison to how you create a more concrete assessment. Um, but I do want to open the floor and make sure that's the most valuable thing we think we can do today, given like it's sort of putting a bow on this discovery phase. And so if there's anything else people want to sort of chew on in a larger group, this is a good time to do it.
I guess the probably the outputs that people are comfortable with from this in terms of like, we've got areas of the maturity model that we've, been clarifying. This has been a good exercise to figure out like what is actually clear enough or not in the maturity model.
Hmm.
And, if we, how do we resolve that versus what we want to accomplish with, a self-assessment framework? And when we want, I'm assuming we want to get it out by North America, in the fall. And, how much work do we need to do to make sure that the self-assessment makes sense when we address a section like, interfaces or measurement, for instance, too.
yeah. So I think Abby and I were chatting about this a little bit. And I think the maturity model and like the assessment are always going to be a little bit of a moving target, I feel like, right? In terms of what capabilities are out there, what tooling is there to help make things easier on folks. what are some of the practices that people use? Like those things will probably always evolve. So I guess one of the things that I was kind of pushing for is getting the assessment out there in some form, right? And then continuing to evolve like both, right? We kind of need to keep everything moving. Um, I mean, right now, right, as you guys know, I came into this with an assessment in my hand, and we continue to use that until there's something better. So I'm using that today, what I have. As soon as this is available, and I'm telling people internally, like, we're working on this, it's coming, it's gonna be, maybe in the next couple of months, we'll have something else. And then I expect that it's gonna be like I don't know, probably not even a 1.0, right? And then eventually, maybe in North America, there's a 1.1 version that has more things kind of baked into it. So that's kind of the mental model I have at the moment.
Yeah, I think I totally agree on wanting to see something evolve from all these conversations. I think where Corbin and I probably have slightly different perspectives is, for me, if we feel like the model is imminently going to be getting an update that would make the assessment fall out a lot simpler, as well as reduce the overhead on things like translations, etc. Like, we may find ourselves wanting to write up about our learnings, which is what drives that assessment up, or that model update, prior to the assessment being written against that newer model, right? So I'm thinking about it from the perspective that's I'm here from like the perspective of the CNCF and like the maintenance overhead. So think like big org, tiny agile team, me stretched between the two. And so like when you think about that with any org, it's like, while it is absolutely reasonable to move forward and like do a best efforts on it, when you're looking at the sort of the knock-on effects, like language translations and like sort of backlinks and confusing messaging to people, because often once they grab something they kind of hang on to it, it's just needs to be a bit aware. And so I'm not yet pulling the ripcord and saying absolutely we can't do an assessment with the way we stand. That's what we're still discussing, right? And I'd love to see us feel confident enough in the model that we can. But part of why the CNCF white papers that we've written so far have such high like esteem and use is because we do so diligently. And so I think we just, and I'm not saying anyone here, like definitely Corbin is not advocating that we do so by the seat of our pants. Like, he's been here with us on this journey as we try and do things better. But that is what we're just trying to balance across all of us as we do this. So yeah, so basically what I hope we can do today in this call, or over the next couple weeks and over the next couple weeks, is maybe just be able to write out why we believe the model works as is. So where we see some rough edges of like, this word is confusing to people. So like I could see a blog post being like, measurement in the model isn't what you think it is. And the blog post is talking about, or like operations in the model isn't what you think it is. Operations is often thought of in these ways, but operations also can be thought of in business operations. In the model, you can see that the conversation and the topics are focused around more of the business operations. And like, just having those kinds of things would give us like the ability to do sort of like tool tips and things on the model itself and on the assessment, to make sure that people are successful with it without having to do a whole rewrite. And little tool tips pointing at a blog post makes translations a lot easier, right? Because all of a sudden you're translating like 5 words to be like, check out this blog post if you're confused, kind of thing. And then the blog post will be in English, but they can choose to translate that or not. But at least the core content is still like not needing to go across 6 languages, quickly to get that sort of reach. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. Like, we can do this without having to stop and be a big lumbering, thing. But we just need to be potentially creative about it, to make sure that we do it in a respectful way for what everyone's done so far and committed so far. So um, that's my thought process. So I
I
think,
mean,
yeah.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think the two sections were most sort of finding words differing or causing concern is around interfaces and operations. But I want to first talk about the idea or the process or the what we're trying to achieve here first and foremost. So if there's more on that, I think that's where we want to focus and make sure we're on the same page first. So
Um, yeah, I think interfaces and operations, but measuring has will need a tooltip
as
because I
well.
think a lot of the emphasis on yeah, and this is I mean there's a bunch that all need to happen, and I think with tooltips and an initial version of the assessment, I think where there's other stuff that we'll have to move on to is like how do you get from one level to another? And there's some judgment, right, about what the levels are, obviously in the maturity model, and the assessment itself, which is a bit more specific than the maturity model about where you land and why you land there. So, some of that really does need to be clarified, however it's done with addendums or what have you, in order for people to figure out what to do. I think another nice thing to do would be to have um, more scenario stuff in blog posts as well. Because I think it's a little short sometimes on scenarios that would be relevant to, more people in more situations than,
Yeah.
the few that are there.
That was
Is
always a dream, was that would be PR'd against with more scenarios.
mm,
But driving that kind of user engagement could be difficult at times, especially without like a focus on it. And I can't say I've done a great job of reiterating that regularly. So um yeah, I guess like in thinking about why we feel like we need tooltips or whatever. I mean, that's like gonna be our code word here on this call. Just for this call, we won't let it let it expand beyond. But that idea of sort of realization that clarification can be helpful, right? In some of the vocabulary, it actually feels quite. I don't want to say consistent, but themed across the three that we're talking about. Like you brought up measurement as well there, David, and we've definitely talked about operations and we've definitely talked about interfaces as well. And I feel like the theme is that the model thinks from the perspective of the platform engineering effort. And that is a bit of a different thing than from the platform itself, like the actual like software or the business users of the platform or like the app dev perspective of using a platform, right? So, and this is a little bit of a mindset shift from that original white paper that was focused on like platforms as a object, as a deliverable that spoke about the engineering effort that goes around it and that there's a team around it, but basically was around what are platforms versus this is the platform engineering maturity model regardless of what your output is, right? Your output could be a set of controllers, it could be a configured SaaS product, it could be a wiki page, like it could be a set of bash scripts, right? Like it's the engineering around those outputs that is what we're discussing. And so I don't know if that resonates with people or not, because I think that starts to for me, if we were to be able to clarify that and then give examples of how operations is the operations of the team and not of the individuals and of the engineering effort, not of the platform itself, because we don't know what your platform is going to look like. That's for the engineers to figure out as they design their product, right? And when you talk about the measurements of like the team capabilities and efforts and learning cycles more so than of just the user experience, because like platform as a product is user experience testing, but like if you're not learning as a team or evolving as a team, you're in trouble. So I don't know, I just in thinking about the three that we have, that kind of struck me as a theme. Does that help?
So the
I
way
think
that I sort of position it when I'm going through the assessment today is that it's primarily focused on evaluating the people and process aspects and less the technology. So the implementation details, like any of that stuff is not really in scope. And there's like a whole separate strategy for that, right? Like so for me, what that looks like at AWS is we have this other project called Canoe, which kind of looks at different technologies and their maturity and like and then we have things like the well architected review that looks at like all these different aspects around how you actually operationalize some of those things. Um so I tend to lean on like those things for the technical implementation, but most of this is focused on like how are the people organized? How do they work? Right? What processes do you have in place? Like those things. So I try to make that distinction pretty clear up front that we're not talking about the tools and implementation detail. And so when I was looking at the interfaces right now, the first one talks about open API spec and things like that, right? Those are like implementation details to me that I'm not getting into that level of just asking, hey, do you have APIs, for example? You know, how you implement that like is up to you, right?
And I would even like, and this is that sort of thing we're going to try and be refining a consistent voice on in the next stage, but like not even using API, say like, does the implementation of the platform, is the implementation of the service revealed to the user of the service? Right? Like, or like something, those are terrible words as well, but something around like, can you change how you deploy something without the user caring about that? Or would they have to change what CLI tool they use because they're going to move from using kubectl to using Argo or whatever, right? Like that's kind of the level I think what you're saying we're trying to get to, and I would agree. And I think that's come out in if you look at our running notes, which I feel like I can. Sorry, Ryan, this has not been the most welcoming of first calls. I think it's your first time joining us
Uh,
on these
all
calls.
good. I'm fine with live.
Um, but the yeah, those are our rolling notes and the spreadsheet that we work off of. And it's like in the rolling notes, it's definitely been a theme of like how do we talk about the outcomes rather than the implementation. Stefan, I think you were going to say something about that as well.
Yeah, but I think when looking across the different sections we've been going through, like I think the scenario, like supporting scenarios, will be really, really great to have more of because we see it's like sometimes we've been talking about the dissonance in some of the characteristics in the different levels, and if you have more like clear scenarios, it'd be way easier to resolve those. I don't think like we don't need to rewrite the complete maturity model, but we need to like make sure we don't have a dissonance where level 3 seems more like level 2 and level 2 seems more like level 3 to like, get some clearance on that instead. And maybe shuffle a few characteristics if they don't fit into place.
The other thing I'd say about the whole process and maturity model is it can sometimes seem forced to have the 4 levels. And I don't know that there's a level 0 the way there should be. Like the provisional, where's the starting point for this maturity assessment? Is it level 1 or is it level 0, like you're not even doing level 1? Is this not clear that level 1, like there are plenty of people who are not necessarily at even level 1. Um, but I don't know if that was the intent. Was the intent for 1 to encompass everything, whether or not you're actually, building platforms or just using them in an old-fashioned sense?
I could for sure write a ranty blog post on a content club or something around how everyone has a platform, just some people talk about it.
Mhm.
It's I feel very strongly that and this is a personal feeling, but it came out in the conversations and how we landed here when we were doing the model, that it's where we are with platform offerings and platform engineering is very similar to where we were with CI/CD, like I don't know, 10 years ago. I was consulting at the time and so many organizations were like, we don't have CI/CD, like we don't have delivery. And I was like, you definitely have a delivery pipeline. It just might not be like codified and it definitely isn't automated, but like there is a process for getting software into production in your organization and we just have to figure out what that is. And the first
Mhm.
step is codifying it. And I feel like that's similar here in that like everyone has at least a provisional level if they have software in production. It may not be very good, it may not be thought about, it may not be intentional, like right, and that's where you come with this voluntary, erratic, by request, ad hoc kind of words. but like they are getting software out to production, and like that means that they have a platform. And I think again, this is my personal belief, is that if you discredit that as a platform, you kind of get into that scenario of like you have to get fit before you can go to the gym, because it's like people think
Yeah,
they
yeah.
haven't yet like gotten on the treadmill, so that's okay. Like they can wait to get on the treadmill until they're ready for the treadmill. And what we want to make them understand is like, no, 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 you're on the treadmill. Like you're just sort of like scraping your knees on it right now and not realizing it. And you could, step up, stand up and walk on it and keep pace on it and whatever. But like, don't think you can ignore that you're already having something to do with platforms.
Yeah, yeah.
But
And
as I
so
say, that's
if
my
that's
rant. I will I
no,
will
no,
step
it's fine.
back.
And it's some of the background on like why it got uh sort of written the way it did. And all I'd say is from level 1 to level 2 occasionally seems like too big of a jump um in the model. That's all.
No, and that's very fair. And I think that comes to Stefan's comment about more scenarios to make it more clear. I think it's interesting that you have called out level 1 to 2, because I've definitely heard other people call out 2 to 3 as the sort of like cliff that people have a hard time getting past. So I think that uh that's really interesting and to keep a pulse on, because it's almost like that argument my parents always have, which is like that they treat my brother and I perfectly amazingly because we both think the other's the favorite. It's like if what we find is like that every level it feels like is a is the same jump, like it's difficult or whatever. We might have created two large jumps, but at least if they're consistent, they can be well reasoned, and then we can think about making them smaller in the next round. But as I said, I don't have enough data on that to know. It's just something that I wanted to call out because I think it's something to keep a pulse on. If we hear other people, if you hear
Hmm.
anecdotes of that, that would be really helpful to feed back into it.
Okay.
I think that people have been talking to, like, if you look at the like the approach to the different levels, they look at it a bit like you're trying to improve your uptime from like 99 to 5 nines. Like the last ones are really expensive and hard to do. So when you want to move from 3 to 4, it's interesting to move in those steps, and sometimes it will be easier to step from 1 to 2 from some, but like in some organizations, it's insanely hard to move from 1 to 2 as well. So it really varies. Are you talking to us, Abby?
Unmuted the wrong thing. I was gonna say, I think that's a really good shout, because I don't want to lose David's experience on that either, that moving from 1 to 2 can be quite difficult, because I think that's really valid. And like I've definitely seen that, where just getting people to buy in that it's it's worth putting that attention to it is a big step a lot of times. And so this is where we're gonna, to the point made in the working group call just before, like there will be times when the data we get is contradictory and we have to figure out why. Is there a like causation there around like scale of org, or whatever, something that we can say this is the reason why this is particularly hard for you? Or is that just indicative of it being a bit unsure on this still?
It's a bit like I threw into the chat, like Bob the delivery pipeline. Like when you have a guy called Bob that builds stuff and copy paste it to the server. Well, he is sort of a platform, but not a very good one.
Well, and the platform goes back all the way to when we stopped writing assembler. I mean, some people don't like, putting it that way, but every time you abstract something underneath that you run on top of, you've got a platform, right?
Mhm.
Our modern view of platforms is that they need to deliver software in distributed environments. And, that's if there's a lot of human glue, that's one thing. But I think that continuous building element is kind of necessary too. And a good reason why, Abby, you're saying like everyone's got something provisional and they're starting somewhere, right? Because they can't possibly be doing everything from scratch. They just may not realize how much they are using, right? Um, okay. Hopefully
Yeah.
we spend a fair bit of time.
So the notes I have so far is that we could use some more scenarios for clarity, uh, for clarity between levels. I think we could use, we may have a theme of why the aspects feel difficult to assess, which is that we are assessing, to Corbin's points, like people and process of platform engineering rather than the tech of the platform outcomes or whatever, or the platform itself. And so there's maybe something there that can do it. So maybe a good next step is to, if we take that theory of, hey, put on the mindset that this assessment is about people and process of the platform engineering effort in an organization, not about the outcomes of the tech. And then we give a read to one of, whoever shouts out the first aspect they want to do, we'll go with, but one of interfaces, operations, or measurement, which we all three sort of had some questions about the way. I think, yeah, one of those three, and we give a read, and if we discuss whether or not it feels as sort of uncomfortable as it did the first time we read through it, or if just that mindset shift gets us into a space where we're like, I could see how this goes. I can see how the questions get derived here. Does that sound reasonable? That puts this to a test quickly, so we know if we can move forward with this kind of an action.
Yeah, and oh, sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was just going to say, I wanted to add one more thing to our notes, which is
Mhm.
something that's come up a few times in the discussions, was the characteristics, which are really useful for trying to work out the nuts and bolts of this. If you try and map them between levels, there are like holes in that grid. So there'll be a characteristic in level 1, and it doesn't tell you what that characteristic looks like in level 2, but then it mentions it again in level 3, or it'll only pop up in level 2, but you don't know what level 1 looked like. So it would be super useful if we could grid the characteristics and go, these ones are the same thing across different levels, and then these ones we don't really tell people what level 1 or level 3 looks like, or whatever the gaps are in that grid of characteristics, because
Yeah.
I think that would help a lot. And whether that's something that we feed back into the like white paper and the model, or whether that's something that we then do as separate blog posts to kind of give people that grid, I don't know, but like that would be really useful.
No, I think that's great. I think you definitely called out something that, again, is probably an unintentional bias, because I don't actually remember having that conversation at the time that we wrote the model, but I definitely grew up in technology at ThoughtWorks, and the ThoughtWorks radar is such that if it doesn't mention it, it didn't move. And so, like, I'm sure that there's like this like underlying bias of like, if you don't see it in the next one, it's because like actually the difference between that characteristic, like the characteristic that's introduced in this level, but doesn't, its difference between that level and the next one maybe isn't major. And I'm not sure, like, I'm not, given we never did that exercise, I could bet we will find some mistakes. So I love it. I've written down the note basically just saying I think that's a really good exercise. So yeah,
Well,
really good idea.
then there's the note they put for a blip that hasn't been mentioned for a while that seems relevant, but it says if it hasn't been mentioned in a while, it may not be like they leave
Eventually,
you
yeah,
with this
over
bit of
time it eventually like
uncertainty,
times out.
you
Yeah.
know. Yeah. So
Definitely not perfect. Yeah. So I think
Just
it's a great
one
shout, Steve. So definitely add that to the list.
one other quick comment is that as I'm going through this assessment, I always refer back to the model. And each category has a very small description of what's meant to capture. And so like when we talk about operations, I always go back to that definition of what are we talking about here, right? Because I want everybody to have that context of we're not talking about high availability and resiliency and 5 nines. We're talking about how does the team operate. And so I think like as we, maybe go through this exercise right now, it's always good to just start from let's read the definition so that we're on the same page about what this category is. And then we can talk about, the characteristics or the questions or whatever, as it relates back to that thing.
Yeah, I think that's where these white papers aren't just a table, right? And our assessment won't just be a set of questions. Like some of my favorite bits of working on this model, my favorite experiences were working with people to try and set the stage for the model table itself. So the conversations around how to like not take this personally, and all these kinds of things, and I could imagine there being similarly some preamble to the questions of put yourself in this mindset, do a review of these kinds of artifacts at your organization to like think about before doing this, so that you're sort of in the right mindset. Like I don't know yet what that's going to look like, but I think we should assume that we will need to generate that. And so these are, I'm going to I capture those in the notes, Corbin, because I think that's the type of thing that will go in there. Cool. So yeah, so I proposed, as I said, a bit of a test of this theory that if we put ourselves in the right mind, not the right, but a specific mindset around the people and process of platform engineering before thinking about creating assessment questions for a couple of these aspects, that would help us be confident in those assessment questions. That's a hypothesis that I would love to test quickly. Because if it doesn't work, then we have to talk about what we can do, what the next hypothesis is, so that we can move forward. So did anyone have a preferred aspect they wanted to go through and test that with, between interfaces, operations, and measurement?
I feel like we were scheduled to talk about interfaces, and that's what I spent time on today, kind of
Perfect.
getting prepared for.
That's why
Perfect.
it's homework too.
Perfect. People who do their homework surprise me every time. Thank you. Thank you too. Cool. So let's do interfaces then. If we open up the model itself and we head down to interfaces, we can see that it is about, it says, how do users interact with and consume platform capabilities? And the interfaces provided by platforms affect how users interact with these platform offerings to provision, manage, and observe capabilities. So putting in the mindset of people and process of the platform engineering effort with that kind of category, how does that help us or not help us gain confidence in creating an assessment for this section? But David and Steve, I don't know if you all did homework. I don't know if other people did too, but you definitely have said so. So if you have things that you wanted to raise that don't fit this prompt as well, that you think would be a better prompt, I'm definitely open to it. Sort of just want to do the highest value thing.
The people in, so when I went back over the section and tried to kind of divide up how I would want to classify maturity of interface, it came down to action-oriented things like how do people take actions with the platform? How do they observe and discover things through or about the platform? And what is the actual user experience? And I think it's possible to reframe quite a bit of that in terms of mostly process stuff, starting out with the initial interface of tickets, moving to, more, I guess, constrained self-service, like, it's self-service, but it's like you put in a build file and the only thing you can do is build, a small set of things, to, more sophisticated self-service where you can build new things on top of the platform using a set of capabilities. And then sort of the final stage of that for me was building new platforms or new platform layers, right? And that I think kind of fits easily into people and process. When you talk about user experience, I don't know how easily. So, for instance, user experience being again kind of mapped into, is it form-based? Does it go to where the user is? Does it use any kind of affordance-based design where it kind of like nudges the user towards scenarios and getting things done with the platform? That you'd be able to indirectly ask people in process by saying, do you have a user experience team that uses, design think, it'd be a little more difficult to, you could reframe it. Like you could say, does your design of new features for the platform attempt to be documentation, and not require documentation or something? Like there'd be a way to put it that could make it fit into this perspective, but I think it gets possibly a little bit awkward. Steve?
It's difficult to ask about things like the usability when people know what the correct answer is, and you need to try and guide them to give you an accurate answer. It's like, I mean, in the doco, it says it's asking whether you actually undertake like user testing, where you check how they use and interact with the platform to see if there are like speed bumps and things getting in their way. So I suppose being slightly oblique and asking about specific practices around that, but not where you're saying you have to use continuous discovery as the structure for how you do this, or you know, like we don't want to kind of push it to a specific framework for that, but you should be doing some kind of usability testing. But how you actually ask that question is slightly tricky. Because it kind of takes you from the early stages of this is like ticket ops, right? Where people use Jira to interact with you and say, please, can you create me a test environment? And then the final version is just, it just happens, right? It might be that you commit your code and that triggers a temporary environment, like an ephemeral environment, and it's all very smooth. But, and again, I'm aware that I've dropped into talking about like platform features, not the interactions, but
I was gonna say, like in some ways, you're
to something smooth that you maybe don't even care about. You don't really interact with it because it just happens.
It does. You did. So you dropped into features, but it's hard not to be fair. But what I also noticed actually more so was that it dropped into assuming that the interfaces, like to David's point, have to be usable, and that the user experience is sort of king of this row. And like, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be usable before the pitchforks come out, but like this row is about like the operability of, or like the maintainability of, and the difficulty of supporting interfaces in a lot of ways, right? More so than, but because when you look at like measurements where you're talking about like how do you gather and incorporate feedback, that's where it's like you can ask a question like, do you um like something around how you assume feedback or don't based on user provided feedback versus like data generated feedback versus what, I don't know, something like that. Versus this one's actually like there's nothing that says integrated services is a good experience here. Like, of course you'd assume that if you're integrating services that it would be a good experience, but like, I don't know, like I have a good example. An IDE that wants to auto close your brackets and they do it poorly. And
So you
I'm
end up
like,
with two
get
brackets, right?
out of here.
You're closing brackets every time. Yeah.
Right? So like that's what I guess what I mean is that like that's integrated to my experience, but it's not, but like they need to be getting feedback from me in some way about that feature not being suitable. And that is through their measurement exercises. And so that's where like it does, like this is the joy and the difficulty of doing an assessment when we break it up by aspect, in my opinion. Because like we talked about in the preamble to the maturity model paper, like in that paper, how like none of these are dependent on each other, but you're very likely to find that if you are at a certain level in one, it may be difficult to progress beyond a certain level in another. So like if you're not doing as a product thinking, you're probably going to have a hard time doing measurement above sort of ad hoc or maybe consistent collection. But even that, you're going to probably not find that happening because who do you have to do it? Like,
Yeah, I think
you know, so
when we were going through this, we acknowledged, didn't we, that there might be the same question in multiple categories. And in a way, it's a little bit like healthcare decision management. When you answer a question, it might increase your heart attack score and your diabetes score
yeah.
from a single question. And I think that's how maybe we would imagine it. A question could add or remove points from more than one category in a way.
I agree. And that is the thing that we need to do a bit of coalescing on. We've had a few different examples. So, your example of adding points in some way. We've had questions per category or per aspect. We've also had conversations around sort of a heat mappy type thing, which maybe pairs up with your point about adding and subtracting points. Where like you create a heat map on any one aspect based on a number of questions. So those are the kinds of things that I think we need to figure out. And I think one of the challenges of the more dynamic versions of those. So I really like, just to be clear, I really like that because I think that is, to your point, more realistic in a lot of ways. But I think to Corbin's experiences, there's a huge amount of value in being able to get people in the right mindset when they're answering questions. And depending on how many questions we have, getting them in the right mindset for all of them up front might not be possible. So there might need to be, but we might choose to break those categories differently. So instead of breaking the categories by aspect, we might break them by people and process across aspect, or something else that would allow for us to like do that, one of those like sort of heat mappy type solutions, but not give people like this unmanageable, unattainable like assessment that they're just like, what are you asking me and why? Yeah, no, that I'm coming with all problems today. Sorry, you all. Those are the things you have to solve.
I guess, one of the things I would say is, although you got fairly close to the technology with your example, Steve, like, I still think that is more related to process than it is the technical implementation detail, right? So, like, what tool do I use, right? We're not talking about crossplane here. We're not talking about Cradix. We're talking about, do you have this capability? And capability is probably the closest we want to get to from a technology perspective. I think that we do need to talk about capabilities here.
Yeah.
It is kind of flirting with the technology a little bit, but I mean, I think the capabilities of the platform, or the capability of the team operating the platform, are critical aspects that go into like how mature are they. So I mean, I fully believe that the capabilities is actually can be a defining thing to maturity in this world that we're in here.
It feels like we're having a tough time sticking to that mindset question that you had, Abby. Maybe another way to take a look is to just not write down, but spin out questions on the levels and kind of define for ourselves what might be good, if we're going from that mindset, what would be good questions that would help us differentiate levels for interfaces. That would come from the perspective of people in process.
Yeah. So do we want to sort of just, I don't want to delete the questions that are on there, but do we want to sort of hide those rows and start?
No, I'm talking about right now, just stream of like we only have
just
15
chat.
minutes. Yeah,
Yep.
just chat.
Cool.
And then we'll take the transcript and
let's try it.
Does the recording include the transcript?
Goes on
We can
YouTube,
get
so I think
one. We
gets a
can get it.
transcript that way. And I do actually think you can download the transcripts as well.
Yes.
So
yeah, I think I did that actually once.
It,
So
it just made me wonder, is like, is there actually a precursor for doing the assessment? Because I've visited a customer and they had no idea what their capabilities were. They know that they were actually building something that was being used, but they hadn't defined it as capabilities. And they were looking at the model like,
But if we make it about people and process, are there ways for us to avoid getting into that kind of cataloging? Because you don't want someone to take a self-assessment and then immediately go, it was a lot of places will go off on a spreadsheet activity if you're not careful, right? Like, oh, we need to do, you know, a complete cataloging of all of our capabilities before we can say how mature we are. And that's definitely not what I think we're trying to get after. So
I wonder
But
if,
but it,
like, this might be
it
etch a sketch end of the world on things, but I definitely don't want to do. But I wonder if you took the example scenarios that are in the model and broke them up a bit to make them less paragraphy and just gave people the ability to say, click the ones which are most represent you, they would effectively be like, I'm looking at the ones in interface and it's a proper paragraph. So you wouldn't want to present that one all in one go. But you could probably create a condensed version of the example scenarios for each level. And by selecting a number of those, because there's like 2 example scenarios for the interface level 1, and then there's a couple of examples for level 2 and a couple of examples for level 3, or just 1, I think. But you can kind of, like, they might select mostly level 1, but with a level 2 in one area. And that would give you a clue to where they are. Like, you can decide what the pin drop algorithm is. Is it just you pick their lowest one, or you somehow create composite score based on all of the answers? But you can kind of, like, and that way it's not leading in any way. It just says which ones feel like you, and you just go that one and that one.
I think that's really interesting because as a format, because I actually had an experience genuinely about 10 years ago now, with a company called Stitch Fix that was like, oh, we'll send you some clothing, free to return, whatever. I think they're still around from what I know. And the way that they have you define your clothing is they put outfits and have you click the one you like the most. And so it's like they're not saying, do you like the color red or blue, or, you know, like, do you wear short sleeves or long sleeves or whatever? They're like, which of these styles sort of fits you? And they do it enough times to, I'm sure,
Yeah.
get a sort of a read on that. And so I think that's a really novel format that we haven't talked about yet. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to test out in that sort of drafting format of, like, can we get through the whole assessment with that, with a reasonable number of questions following all of our other constraints, right? A reasonable number of questions that can be self-assessed and not require a professional, and blah, blah, blah. So very interesting. I'm
Well,
gonna
I
add that to the notes.
mean, to be fair, right? That is the reason that I created the assessment to begin with. Is because as an end user company, I have to come in here and go, okay, like, here's a list of characteristics and scenarios. Which one do I look like? Right? And I'm like, well, I kind of look like this one, but I do have this thing over here. Like, it's hard to, like, figure out, like, am I a elephant or am I a rhinoceros? I mean, I don't know. So that was kind of the thing, is can I give people, like, a simple set of questions, which is why I started with, like, the yes no format. Can I give somebody a simple set of questions that helps them evaluate those characteristics, right? Like, and so it's like, in human language, do you have this thing? Yes or no? Well, we kind of have that thing. Yes. Do we have this thing? No. Okay, so now you've gone through this exercise. Now I can say, okay, well, based on these things, you have more characteristics in group 1 or group 2 or group 3 or group 4, right? So, I mean, I think, to me, like, I think the thing that you talked about, Steve, earlier was actually the easiest thing in my mind, which is, could I take the characteristics and map that out across the levels and figure out, do I have carryover? Do I have a description? Is this the next maturity thing from this other thing, or is this something completely new? Right? Are those things related?
Yeah, and it kind of gives you a way of, when people were saying that the jumps between levels were kind of big, if you had that breakdown of characteristics, you could look to improve per characteristic as well, which gives you smaller bites to eat. So it might be a way of finding like the weakest characteristic within your weakest category, if that's the thing that you think you need to improve. So, because I don't think necessarily it's like, well, that's your worst thing, so you should improve it. Sometimes it's like you kind of have to be a bit more like, we're strong in this area, and improving that will have more impact. So,
And that's ultimately like what happens at the end, right? So at the end of the assessment that I do now, like there's two categories that are the areas that we want to focus on. And then within those two categories, there's maybe a couple of things within those categories that we want to like really focus on. So that there'll actually be like, hey, you should evaluate, here's the three things maybe that you should focus on. Do these align with your goals? Do these, are these the right three things for you? Just going off like how you answered, right? They may say right now, like I had a customer who said, like, you don't have an executive sponsor. You need one of those, right? But they said, hey, we're going through like a transformation. We have some new leaders coming in and out. Like right now is not the good time for that. So we're going to shelve that one. Okay. And then we moved on to the other two, and they're like, we really want to invest in these other two, right? And one of them was around measurement. They didn't have a really good capability for measurement. So I think that's the kind of how it works out, So I think you're on the right track. So I think that's a super useful exercise. Like I can envision this matrix, take the characteristics, map them, by level, see which ones sort of carry over, which ones represent the next maturity for that thing. That might be super helpful and lead to what questions do we need to kind of map into that? Because that was the coverage issue, right? Like, do we have coverage? When we look at the questions, are we reflecting like these characteristics effectively, right? So I think that gives us a better idea of what the coverage map actually is. So maybe that's the homework. I don't know. I don't think we can do that in 6 minutes, but maybe we can start it.
I would say there is the question within the last 5 minutes. I think a lot of people are going to be involved in that next phase. And so I think our current plan is I'm going to remove the public invite from the calendar to remove confusion. So I'm going to put in a request that gets removed. We are going to be able to use either the Zoom that we used to use for the working group, like before we went CNCF official. We still have access to that. I can still get the downloads of it. I still feel we as a group will have to decide if we feel comfortable posting those videos up on YouTube. Like the point of closing the group is not to be like secretive. It's more just to be consistent for that like sort of consolidation period of time. And so we as a group can decide, but I think it'd be good to have the video so we can decide rather than be like, oh, well, we could have showed you, it wasn't secret. So I'll figure out a way to make sure we have videos of those calls so that we can make that decision. But yeah, my current plan is that we will kick off that conversation next week at the same time because everyone already has that booked off. And we will figure out what the right cadence is, what the right conversations are, etc. So, but to Corbin's point, do we want to set homework before next Tuesday?
I mean, personally, I'd love to be in a place where we have in hand like one of these mapped out in that format, just to determine, is that something repeatable and something we can use as a tool to enable us to validate the questions that we have or define new questions or whatever, right? Like, I think right now it's a little bit unclear. Are these the right questions?
Yep.
Right? Probably not. Like, I think some of them require some consolidation. Some of them are going to require we add a new question because we're missing something. And the only way to know that, I feel like, is potentially this exercise. I think it'd be super useful.
Do you think, Corbin, would you mind writing, because I know that, like, for example, some people have asked, like, can you let me know if like I won't be on this call, can you let me know if there's any homework? Would you mind writing a summary of that ask? And basically one of the things that worked really well with the drafting of the maturity model is we allowed everyone to go off and do as they see fit based on the ask at hand, and then come back together and see where we have commonalities and where we have differences, because that drove out like what beliefs we as a group wanted to uphold by seeing those in action. So anybody who has the chance to be able to do that before next Tuesday can bring their papers in. That will get us started, and that is sort of the first action of this consolidation group, is get a working example of questions so that we can hopefully divide and conquer a bit to come back together and review and do that. But yeah, so if you could do that, that'd be great. I'm going to take the action of managing calendars, admin for the win, and making sure that that all gets sorted. Yeah, and I'm just looking forward to getting this out into the hands of people, like with a consistent format, so that we can get really helpful feedback rather than sort of scattered feedback across things, everything from the tone of the question to the structure of the assessment to the whatever. Like that divides out the feedback that we get, and I think we can bring it together a bit.
Okay.
And the next call will be Tuesday the 4th.
Tuesday the 4th at 5. Yes.
Yes, I'm
5
in
p.m. Sorry,
Lisbon.
5 p.m.
I'm
UTC.
gonna find somewhere to join.
Because you're traveling.
Yeah, I'm traveling that week for work.
Okay.
So
Okay.
yeah.
Cool. Hopefully you can. Again, we'll have videos so that we can do what we need to with those and stuff. But we'd love to have you there. So awesome. Well, with 2 minutes to go, does anyone have any parting thoughts? But we've got our actions for the day. Anything else that we want to finish off? Ryan, how overwhelming and terrible was this experience with a whole bunch of people talking without giving any context?
No, it's all good. I'm kind of trying to catch up, I guess, as you all have been working on this for a while. I think last week I tried to contribute a little bit on some of the measurement stuff, and there's some good convo in the Slack around that. There felt like there were some parallels with that. So
Great.
yeah, just dump the homework, and I'll try and spend a bit of time on that. I'm still trying to make these calls as much as possible, but the timing for myself isn't great, so I can do stuff.
To be fair, as I said, what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks is a little bit of a smaller group that's been sort of doing these calls for a few months now, so has the context from lots of people who have come and gone across the week. So you get a break, you get to sleep in for at least a couple of weeks, but the idea is to take all the content from these discovery calls, consolidate them into a consistent format, and go back out as quickly as possible to get feedback. So that's where you will be a huge benefit, is again of like coming in with your thoughts on like, hey, you missed this thing we talked about, or this doesn't sound like the direction that we went, or whatever. Like holding that smaller group to account to make sure that it actually reflects the conversations, so, and your experiences and needs from an assessment. So cool. All right, well then, y'all, it is officially the hour, so I will see you all in Slack and on future calls.
All
Thank
right.
you all for your time.
See you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.